Tired of scientific jargon? Get the facts without the friction. This is Weekly Digested Science, where we translate the world's most significant peer-reviewed research into your weekly news update. For a trustworthy source of knowledge, hit like and subscribe.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. You know, if you're like most of us, you've probably followed this one big dietary rule for, the last 40 years or so.
Saturated fat is bad news.
Exactly. We were told, keep it under 10% of your calories. The fear was always clogged arteries, heart attacks.
Yeah.
All of that.
Right. It's been the absolute bedrock of dietary guidelines in the U.S. since, the late 70s, early 80s?
Yeah. But, and this is the kicker, when you start looking at the newer, really big global studies, well, that simple rule starts to look maybe not just outdated, but potentially harmful even.
And that's really what we're digging into today. We're kind of challenging that default nutritional setting, you could say.
Right.
Our mission here is to take a really critical look at the evidence that propped up those SFA limits for so long. Because, as you'll see, you really can't just talk about one nutrient on its own anymore. You have to look at the food. It comes in the food matrix and, the whole dietary picture to figure out what's actually driving health risks.
Okay, so the big question we're tackling for you is, could following that decades-old advice to ditch saturated fat actually be undermining your health? Let's get into it. So, just to get everyone on the same page quickly, we're mainly talking about three kinds of fat here. Saturated fats, SFAs, then monounsaturated MUFAs, think olive oil,
Right.
and polyunsaturated PUFAs. And historically, it was those SFAs, the ones solid at room temp, that got labeled the villain.
Yeah, the dietary bad guy. And look, that label came largely from early studies that were super focused on cholesterol levels. But when researchers started looking beyond just cholesterol at actual health outcomes like heart attacks or, dying from any cause, the picture got, messy. Pretty fast.
Let's see how.
Well, recent big reviews, meta-analyses looking at both trials and observational studies, they often found no real benefit when people just cut back on their total saturated fat.
Wait, no benefit. So avoiding butter for low-fat yogurt maybe didn't help with living longer.
In many analyses, no. And some even hinted at a potential protective effect against stroke when SFA intake wasn't super low.
Okay, this is exactly why we need a really solid global perspective. What happens when you look beyond just Western countries?
And that brings us right to probably the most important study in our sources today, the PRE study, Prospective Urban Rural Epidemiology.
PRE.
And this wasn't small. We're talking 135,000 people, 18 countries across 5 continents, crucially, including low and middle income places.
So a truly global snapshot, getting away from maybe our typical Western dietary biases.
Exactly. And what they found, it basically flipped the old advice on its head.
Okay, tell me.
It was pretty shocking, actually. PRE found that higher carbohydrate intake, especially when carbs made up more than, say, 60% of total energy.
Which is pretty common in many parts of the world, right?
Very common. That high carb intake was strongly linked to an increased risk of dying overall. Higher carbs meant higher total mortality.
Okay, and what about fat?
That's where it gets really interesting. Higher total fat intake, and this includes all types, SFA, MUFA, and PUFA, was associated with a lower risk of total mortality.
Lower risk, with more fat.
Lower risk. And here's the real head scratcher for the old dogma. Higher saturated fat intake specifically was linked to a lower risk of stroke.
Okay, hold on. That's the ultimate wait, what moment. The whole reason we were told to avoid SFAs was because they raise LDL cholesterol, the bad kind.
Right.
So how can something that raises LDL be linked to lower death rates overall? That seems completely contradictory.
This is such a crucial point. And yeah, it does seem contradictory at first glance. It gets a little technical, but it's key. When SFAs raise your LDL cholesterol number, they mainly increase the number of larger, more buoyant LDL particles. Think of them as big, fluffy beach balls floating around.
Okay, big fluffy beach balls. What does that mean for my arteries?
Well, they're thought to be less atherogenic, meaning they're less likely to actually get stuck in the artery walls and build up plaque compared to other types of LDL.
So there are different kinds of LDL. There's not just one bad guy.
Exactly. And conversely, diets really high in carbohydrates, especially refined ones, tend to push up the number of small, dense LDL particles. Those are the ones often described as being little sticky BB pellets.
Oh. Okay, and those are the dangerous ones.
Those are the ones strongly linked to penetrating the artery wall and driving atherosclerosis. So high-carb diets can create a really adverse lipid profile overall. Lower HDL, the good cholesterol, much higher triglycerides, and a higher ratio of ApoB to ApoA1.
ApoB to ApoA1, that's a better marker.
Many experts think it's a superior marker because it tracks those dangerous, small, dense particles. And in the PRE study, people eating more saturated fat actually had a better, lower ApoA1 ratio.
So you might have been focusing on the wrong cholesterol number, or at least not the full picture.
It looks that way. Total LDL just doesn't tell the whole story. The trade-off, what you replace the SFA with, seems much more important than just the SFA number itself.
That makes a lot more sense. Okay, so it's about the replacement. But let's dig into the SFAs themselves. Are all saturated fats created equal? I mean, is the SFA in, say, coconut oil the same as the SFA in beef or dark chocolate?
No, absolutely not. That's another layer of nuance we lost in the old all SFA is bad message. Saturated fat is really a family of different fatty acids.
Okay.
And their effects can differ based on their chemical structure, specifically their carbon chain length.
So which ones were causing the LDL spike that got everyone worried initially?
The ones with the biggest impact on raising LDL levels are generally the medium to long chain ones. Lauric acid, myristic acid, and palmitic acid. Those are C12 to C16. They're found in things like coconut oil, palm oil, and dairy fat.
Got it. C12 to C16. But you mentioned dark chocolate and beef.
Right. Take stearic acid. That's an 18-carbon SFA, C18. It's abundant in cocoa butter, so dark chocolate, and also in beef tallow. Research suggests stearic acid has a pretty neutral effect on cardiovascular risk markers. It doesn't seem to raise harmful LDL the way the others do.
Huh. So chain length really matters. What about dairy fat? You mentioned it contains some of those LDL raisers, but dairy often gets a pass, health-wise.
Dairy is fascinating. Yes, it has palmitic acid, but it also contains unique odd-chain SFAs, C15.0 and C17.0. Scientists actually use these as biomarkers, like little flags, for how much dairy fat someone's eating.
Okay.
And consistently, studies show these odd-chain SFAs are either neutral regarding heart disease risk or sometimes even inversely associated, meaning higher levels might correlate with lower risk.
Lower risk from a dairy fat marker. Interesting. This leads us right into that idea of the food matrix, doesn't it? It's not just the fat, it's the whole package.
Precisely. That's become a huge theme in modern nutrition. You can't just isolate one nutrient. Look at actual foods that are relatively rich in SFAs. All-fat yogurt, cheese, unprocessed meat, even dark chocolate. Generally, eating these foods is not linked to increased risk of heart disease or diabetes in most observational studies.
Could you give an example of the matrix effect?
Yeah, cheese is a great one. Some studies compared eating hard cheese versus eating butter, matched for the amount of saturated fat. And eating the cheese actually led to lower LDL cholesterol compared to the butter. The idea is that other components in the cheese, the calcium, the proteins, maybe the fermentation process, change how the body handles that fat. The matrix buffers the effect.
That really drives home the eat whole foods message. Okay, but now for maybe the biggest twist. Connecting back to those carbs we talked about, you're saying the saturated fat showing up in my blood test might be high because I eat too much sugar, not too much steak.
Yeah.
That sounds wild.
It is wild, but it's a profound metabolic truth that the old guidelines completely missed. We absolutely have to distinguish between the saturated fat you eat and the saturated fat that's circulating in your blood.
Okay, two different things.
Totally different. And the levels of certain circulating SFAs, especially palmitic acid, that C16 one we mentioned, that one is strongly linked to metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. But its levels in your blood track much more closely with your carbohydrate intake, especially refined carbs and sugars, than with how much saturated fat you ate.
How? How does that work? How does eating bread turn into saturated fat in my blood?
It's a process called de novo lipogenesis, literally making new fat.
De novo lipogenesis, okay.
When you flood your body with excess carbohydrates, more than it needs for immediate energy, your liver basically says, whoa, too much sugar, gotta store this. And it converts those excess carbs into fatty acids.
And that fat it makes is?
Primarily palmitic acid, that C16 saturated fat. So if you're consuming a lot of refined carbs and sugars, your body is literally manufacturing its own supply of the very saturated fat linked to metabolic problems, regardless of how much fat you ate with your meal.
Wow. So the enemy wasn't necessarily the fat on the plate, but the sugar in the pantry causing internal fat production.
For many people, especially those who are already leaning towards insulin resistance, that seems to be a much bigger piece of the puzzle. Cutting back hard on refined carbs might be the most effective way to lower those specific harmful circulating SFA level.
Yeah. Okay. Mind blown a little bit there. So we've sort of exonerated whole food SFAs and pointed a finger at refined carbs.
Mm.
But there's one more villain lurking, right? Processing. How does that mess everything up?
Ah, yes. Processing, and specifically the ghosts of trans fats past. This likely explains why some older studies did seem to show harm from saturated fat.
How so?
Many of those historical trials weren't just comparing, say, butter to olive oil. They were often comparing SFA-rich fats like butter or lard to vegetable oils that had been partially hydrogenated.
The source of artificial trans fats.
Exactly. We now know trans fats are incredibly harmful for cardiovascular health, far worse than SFAs. So those studies were essentially comparing saturated fat to trans fat and concluding SFA was bad because the trans fat alternative was maybe slightly less bad in some outcomes or just different. The harm they saw might have been mostly from the trans fats and other contaminants created during that harsh processing, not the SFA itself.
So even a seemingly healthy oil can become problematic if it's heavily processed.
Absolutely. Take coconut oil again. In some animal studies, highly refined, bleached, and deodorized RBD coconut oil did raise cholesterol, but minimally processed virgin coconut oil often doesn't have the same effect.
Why the difference?
Harsh refining can create contaminants, things like glycidyl esters and MCPD esters. These processing byproducts might be driving some of the negative metabolic effects we see, completely separate from the oil's natural fatty acid profile.
And the ultimate example of processing danger seems to be frying, right? What did that Women's Health Initiative study show?
Yeah, that was a large observational study looking at postmenopausal women in the U.S. The results were pretty stark.
What did they find?
Higher consumption of any fried food was clearly linked to a higher risk of dying from any cause, and also specifically from cardiovascular causes.
Any fried food. Was anything particularly bad?
The risk seemed particularly high for things like fried chicken and fried fish or shellfish.
Why is frying so uniquely bad? It's not just the fat, is it?
No, it's a multi-pronged assault, really. First, the food absorbs a lot of the cooking fat, drastically increasing its calorie density. Second, the high heat degrades the cooking oil itself, causing oxidation, hydrogenation, potentially creating trans fats even if you started with a good oil.
Okay.
And third, the high temperatures trigger chemical reactions in the food itself, forming potentially toxic compounds like advanced glycation end products, AGAs, and acrylamides, especially in starchy foods. These compounds are thought to promote inflammation and oxidative stress.
So it's the heat, the damaged fats, and the chemical changes in the food. Again, processing is key.
Absolutely. It underscores that how a food is prepared can be just as, if not more, important than its starting ingredients.
Okay, this whole deep dive has really turned the conventional wisdom upside down. We're not really talking just about fat content anymore. It's about what you replace it with, how it's processed, and how many carbs you're eating.
Yeah.
So let's boil this down. What's the action plan for listeners? What are the key takeaways they can use right now?
All right, let's distill it into 4 main points, moving towards that more nuanced, food-focused approach.
Okay, number one.
Number 1, forget that rigid 10% SFA limit. It's just not supported by the best current evidence. Sticking to it often leads people to do the worst thing possible.
Which is?
Replacing those whole food fats with refined carbohydrates. That's almost certainly a net negative for your metabolic health.
Okay, ditch the arbitrary limit, number 2.
Number 2, focus entirely on the substitution. If you do decide to eat less saturated fat, make absolutely sure you replace it with unsaturated fats, MUFAs from olive oil, avocados, nuts, or PUFAs from fatty fish or seeds. Not with sugars or refined starches. That's the only swap that consistently shows potential health benefits.
Got it. Replace SFA with MUFA or PUFA, never carbs. What's number 3?
Number 3, choose whole fats. Prioritize getting your fats from whole or minimally processed sources. Think whole-fat dairy like plain yogurt and cheese, good quality dark chocolate thanks to that stearic acid and polyphenols,
Right.
unprocessed meats, and definitely those MUFA-rich plant sources like extra virgin olive oil, avocados, nuts, and seeds. Remember the food matrix? The whole package matters.
Makes sense. Whole foods first. And the final takeaway.
And number 4, avoid the real dangers, refined carbs, and harsh processing, especially frying. Minimize sugars, white flour, and processed snacks, particularly if you know you have insulin resistance or other metabolic issues. And really limit fried foods and anything that's been subjected to super high heat or heavy industrial refining.
Why?
Because our sources strongly suggest these excess refined carbs and the damage from processing and frying are likely the primary drivers of cardiovascular risk in modern diets, much more so than the natural saturated fat found in whole foods.
So, thinking about it, maybe the single biggest dietary change most people could make isn't meticulously trimming fat, but dramatically cutting back on sugars and refined grains,
Yeah.
especially if they want to lower that internally produced palmitic acid.
That shift in focus could be huge. It changes how you look at everything. Instead of just asking how much fat is in this, the more important questions become how processed is this? And am I swapping out healthy fats and proteins for empty carbs?
Right.
The future really seems to be about making smarter choices based on food quality and individual metabolic health, not just blindly following outdated, oversimplified rules about single nutrients. It's about intelligent selection.
Under the canopy where shadows play, crickets sing secrets at the edge of day. A bird calls sharp like a question in the air.